Welcome to the Mumbles Christadelphian screencast. This is the second in a small series in which we have been reflecting on the COVID-19 pandemic and the implications that it's had for our community and beyond. This morning, I'm joined by Stephen Palmer. Stephen's a member of the Mumbles meeting, but also, really interesting at this time, he's a medical epidemiologist who specialises in infectious disease. So welcome, Stephen.
Good morning.
How are you?
Yeah.
Good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. Stephen, listen, I'm going to give you 1 minute. Tell us, what does an epidemiologist do?
Okay, well, the sort of epidemiologist that's quoted in the media now every minute of every day, that's mathematical epidemiology. They're modelers. They are computer epidemiologists looking at the patterns of disease at the population levels. So they're statisticians, mathematicians. Sort of epidemiology I've done in my career is medical epidemiology, where we would go out into the field to investigate outbreaks and try to control outbreaks, measure how much disease there is in the whole population, trying to find out the causes of disease, and ultimately trying to prevent the occurrence of those diseases. So epidemiology is pretty much the basic science, medical science of public health, and that's what I've been practicing. Interestingly enough, during my career, I seem to have spent a lot of my time on what are called the zoonotic diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. And of course, it's widely understood now that the coronavirus that we're dealing with has its origins, as most viruses have done that affect humans, in the animal population.
That's incredibly interesting. It seems an irony to me that you know, for I don't know how many years you've been an epidemiologist. And now just in this last, few months, we've had this massive pandemic.
Well, it is ironic because, all my career we've been preparing for it. Then I retire, then it happened. Of course,
I should think they've still kept you pretty busy. What are your opinion on things?
Well, it's a really important thing. Of course, it's a very serious situation to have a pandemic like this. There have been previous coronavirus outbreaks. There was, remember, back in 2012, what was called MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which humans have caught from their camels, believe it or not. The camels may have been infected by bats. Bats seem to be a major reservoir for human infection. And then before that, there was the SARS coming out of China in 2002. Right. They were contained. They didn't spread in the same way that the current one is. And of course, epidemiology doesn't just look at the virology and how things are transmitted. It looks at the underlying factors. And one of the things that the world has to consider now is why do these diseases emerge? And some of the reasons are to do with human activity, population growth, invasion of the habitats of these animals, and then international travel, spreading the disease through people being pressed together and transmission occurring, and then spreading it across the world. So you have to look at the bigger picture as well as the infection themselves, as what human activity is doing to actually expose itself to these sorts of diseases.
That's incredibly interesting. And I'm sure we could discuss this pandemic in extraordinary detail, particularly, if I could pick your brain. It wouldn't take us long to discuss it from my perspective. But listen, I read a headline saying that we're all epidemiologists now. I'm particularly interested, though, as you know, in biblical perspectives. And I've heard you talk in the past for many years about infectious diseases, particularly in relation to the law of Moses and the amazing foresight of the Bible. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's really very, very interesting. Ever since, even before I went to medical school, I was interested in this. I was shown a book by a long time ago now, a professor of medicine in Bristol called Professor Rendell Short, and he wrote a book which was a little paperback book, very well known amongst sort of Bible students, called The Bible and Modern Medicine, in which he sketched out some of the things that the Bible speaks about that have to do with public health. And when I went to medical school, I sometimes had time on my hands and went into the library and read a lot of the history of medicine and history of epidemiology. I didn't realize I would have a career in it, but let me be interested in some of the quotes I found there.
Yeah, come on. I'm really interested.
Okay, so let me just, I've collected them over the last 50 years, kept them safe because they've been quite influential for me. So this was The History of Preventive Medicine, book written way back in 1970.
Okay.
And it says, one has but to read the Bible carefully and thoughtfully to conclude that the wisdom expressed therein regarding health, hygiene, and sanitation form the groundwork of today's public health rules. These biblical rules on health and hygiene were far in advance of and superior to any which then existed in the world.
That's just
another
an extraordinary statement, isn't it?
Yeah. Another one, this is Singer and Underwood. This was the standard history of medicine textbook, Oxford University Press, way back in 1962. It says, among the physicians of classical antiquity, we find no consistent view of the transmission of infection by contact. In fact, indeed, the whole idea of infection was effectively absent from them. It was reserved for the Middle Ages to conceive serious official measures against the spread of epidemics. These measures were derived from the leper ritual of the Bible and its fundamental concept of isolation. And just one more. This was a book from 1977, Medicine in the Bible and the Talmud. And then it says, although the Bible is not a medical text, the material contained in some portions of, refers to the book of Leviticus, is so factual that even the sophisticated present-day student cannot help but be amazed at what he reads there, especially the sanitary regulations of cleanliness and purity, such as prohibition of the consumption of blood, the quarantine for infectious diseases. It says they are unique and do not occur in the codes of the civilized nations of antiquity that surrounded the land of Israel. So is that sort of comment about the Bible from proper historians of medicine who pointed out the remarkable insight the Bible seems to have. Now, since then, of course, the world has become much more secular and you don't find that sort of comment anymore. But during my own career, I've constantly been reading the Bible and doing epidemiology, and it's quite remarkable just how those two things fit together so beautifully.
It seems to me that some of those quotations are amazing. Listen, is there anything, do you feel, particular relevance to the coronavirus, this COVID-19 outbreak? Is there anything from that you think, well, actually, that specifically applies to what we're seeing in the world right now?
Well, it sounds perhaps too simple for people, but when you realize that throughout the history of the world, the idea that diseases are transmitted, that there are germs that pass from one person to the other, the idea of contagion has not been understood. And in fact, in many parts of the world, it's not understood now. In Africa, where the Ebola virus is epidemic still, one of the major ways of transmitting it is from contact with dead bodies. Right. And there are rituals for burial in some customs where many relatives and friends gather around and actually touch the dead body. And because of that, you get these explosions of infection because the body is highly infectious. Yeah. Well, scripture, the law of Moses in particular, don't touch a dead body. Right. You'll be unclean. You'll be unclean for a whole week. You can't go about your normal duties. You've got to be outside the camp. That sort of thing. Now, when it comes to coronavirus, Pete, just think, what was the first thing we were all instructed to do? Wash our hands. Sure, yeah. And it's still the single most important thing we can all do. We're trying to teach our children. Wash your hands 10 times a day. When you go out, when you come in, wash your hands, and don't touch your face with hands that might have picked up the germs. So that hand washing is fundamental. Most people throughout history haven't understood that, and yet the Bible. Can I quote you a passage?
Yeah, I'd be really interested. Just tell me, while you're finding that passage,
Yeah.
when was the Law of Moses written? I mean, is
Okay.
it?
We're talking 3,000 plus years ago, 3,500 years ago.
Okay.
These instructions come way back in antiquity, when people didn't understand about diseases. They thought diseases were caused by evil spirits. They thought that they were caused by bad smells in the air. They didn't understand about contagion at all.
Okay.
When you read Leviticus chapter 15, okay, and this is the law concerning bodily discharges. So my Bible heading has it. So, and it goes on in quite some length, but it says, whoever touches anything that somebody with a discharge, somebody who's got stuff running out of their body, not pleasant, but that's the medical reality. Whoever touches the bed or anything else that the person who's ill has come in contact with, says, must wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean. He who touches the body of him who has the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean. And the person who's got the disease, the person who is contaminating others, if he touches them, they're contaminated. But it says, if he has not rinsed his hands in water.
Sure.
In other words, if he's rinsed his hands in water and he touches something, it's not unclean. And this idea of rinsing one's hand in water, and the scriptures have a lovely phrase in the Hebrew. It's living water. Running water is living water.
Yeah.
Running water cleanses from this discharge, this uncleanness. Now you think, well, that's obvious. No, but it's not obvious, and it never was obvious to people. And yet, the Bible has this. Now, the other big issue, Peter, is social distancing. We all know that, don't we?
Sure.
That stay 2 meters away, because the evidence for 2 meters, not 1.5 meters, not 3 meters, it's a little bit dodgy. But social distancing is exactly what happens under the law of leprosy in the Bible, and this is Leviticus chapter 13. So the priest is a doctor, right? The priest shall examine the person, and they've got a sore, or they've got a rash, or they've got something like that. And then the priest, if he's not sure what the diagnosis is, this is what it says in verse 4 of this is Leviticus chapter 13. The priest shall isolate the one who has the sore for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. And indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore was not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him again. And if in the end it turns out to be leprosy, this poor person is put outside of the camp. Now, it sounds cruel, but if you're protecting the whole camp from a deadly infectious disease, putting people in isolation is exactly what we would do today. And then just one other thing, which I found.
I mean, that is extraordinary, though. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I had some of the symptoms for the coronavirus. I mean, I've not been tested. It's not possible for me to be tested at this time. And, probably if I was, I perhaps haven't had it. But interestingly, I had to be in isolation for 7 days. It just seems extraordinary to me that over 3,000 years ago, the law of Moses is asking the same things.
That's right. And telling you to wash your hands. And obviously, if you look in hospitals and in care homes where there have been patients with infection, the area is disinfected. The bedding and the room and the handles and doors and everything is disinfected. Well, why? Because they've been touched by somebody who's got the condition, which is exactly what the law of Moses has said. Amazing. And then leprosy, isolation. And then there's one other thing, the person with leprosy, of course, it's a really sad thing that somebody had to go through this. But it says, now the leper shall cover his mustache.
Right.
He should cover his mustache, obviously with some sort of cloth or robe or garment. And he shall cry, unclean, unclean. In other words, stay away from me, stay away from me. So it's not amazing. And the whole debate today is whether we should wear face masks. And the Welsh government has said it's not going to recommend it, and the English government has recommended it. And the question is, the evidence isn't so clear-cut. But the idea of face masks, is something that was actually suggested there.
Well, that's amazing to me that there are people walking around Tesco today obeying the law of Moses. They don't even know it.
That's right. And the fourth point I would say is relevant is that probably the coronavirus came into the human population from bats in China. Even if, as some conspiracy theories suggest, it was escaped from a laboratory. These are viruses which are harbored in bat populations. They may go into another animal, which is used for food, like the SARS virus came from, it seems, civet cats, which are a wild animal that are sold in live markets and very close proximity to human activity. Now, the law of Moses, of course, was very, very strict on preventing contact with animals which were called unclean. And most of the animals, like the bats and the civet cats and so on, they were not food animals as far as the Bible is concerned. They were excluded. They were unclean. Don't touch them. Don't touch the dead carcass. No reason to go and catch them because you're not going to eat them because they're unclean. And you think, well, boy, that would have, Ebola virus in Africa is acquired from fruit bats, bought for food. And the law of Moses basically would have put a gap between those viruses and the human population because of its stringent food laws.
So does the law of Moses specifically say among the unclean animals that you can't eat bat?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Chapter 11 of the law of Moses, bats are listed amongst many other animals. Cats and dogs wouldn't be allowed. The only animals that you could eat were cloven-footed, chewing the cud type animals. In other words, the domestic cows and sheep, and on the bird side, the chickens and so on. All the things that we would consider wholesome to eat, apart from pigs. Pigs were excluded. And of course, under the conditions in which pigs live in those times, they were highly, highly dangerous animals. And today, even pigs are very close to humans in their biology, and therefore the viruses that pigs have can actually cross into the human population relatively easily.
Okay.
I'm not saying we don't eat pork today because we're not under that law, and pork is produced in hygienic environments that are strictly controlled. But as an animal, they are pretty dangerous. You can understand the wisdom. Where did it get that wisdom from? That's the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it just strikes me as being remarkable that the Bible over 3,000 years ago is talking about how humans should not have contact with dead bodies, including, animals, how that they needed to hand wash, laws around quarantine and isolation. This does seem to me to be remarkable. But what about other ancient civilizations, like the Egyptians, the Babylonians? Didn't they have laws of hygiene and public health?
But yeah, it's a really good question, Peter. I've sort of tried to research that as much as I can. And you and I, we've been to the British Museum, haven't we? We've seen what the ancient Egyptians were like. We've seen what the ancient Assyrians and Babylonians were like, the superpowers of the day when Israel were not trying to follow the law of Moses. And they believed that diseases were caused by magic. And the medicine of ancient Egypt in the time of Moses was based on the temple worship. And it's all about treatment. So if you go to the British Museum, you see these ancient papyri, the Ebers Papyrus and the London Papyrus and so on. And what they are telling you is if you want to get a treatment for a disease, say this incantation, offer this gift to the gods. And they don't have public health in the way the law of Moses does. Yeah. And the other thing is, the law of Moses has nothing magical about it. There are no silly things to do. There are no ideas of diseases coming in some spiritual way through the air. It seems to have been understood that contagion and isolation and quarantine were the ways to deal with infectious diseases, and it inculcated into the Jewish people this sense of the need for hygiene and washing. And actually, throughout the ages, they have fared better in pandemics. Sometimes, look, in the Black Death in the 14th century in Europe, Jews were blamed for the disease. Yeah. There was an anti-Semitic slur, and they were persecuted, and terrible things were done to them. Why? Because they seemed to survive more than other people. Why? Because they washed their hands, because they had this sense of hygiene. The Assyrians themselves, they didn't, as far as I can tell, they did not have any of this concept of public health ideas. It was magic medicine again. The Bible doesn't have the magic. In fact, there are no treatments in the law of Moses, which, is an interesting point. It seems to be prevention that was understood. Right. And yet they didn't, as far as their science was concerned, there would have been no basis for understanding that.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that either Moses, this just sort of extraordinary scientist, but what we know of Moses is actually he grew up in Egypt for 40 years before he went into a wilderness for another 40 years, before he then went into another wilderness, taking with him the best part of 2 million people with these laws. So, where's Moses got these insights from? If you're telling me that the ancient Egyptians weren't following these laws of public health, where's Moses got them from?
Well, that's a really important question. And again, if I may read a little bit of the law to you. This is from the book of Deuteronomy, now chapter 4. And this is where Moses says the law came from. He says, it's God speaking. Surely I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What great nation is there that has God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us? So, Moses says to Israel, you keep this law and the nations are going to go, wow, where did they get those laws from? Which is what we're talking about today, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the answer is God gave it to them. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is really strong evidence that the Bible claimed to be the revelation from God is actually true.
I mean, when you reflect on this, and with the knowledge that you have with your career, and then clearly as a Bible student, do you find that just in times like this that information helps you with your own personal faith?
Yes, I do. Quite a lot of people seem to think that the Bible is out of date, it's been discredited, science has disproved it, science will have the answer. And I look at the science today, the mantra is we're following the science, as if there was one set of things that is hard and fast. And yet scientists are disagreeing. They're disagreeing about the models that should be followed. They're disagreeing about the best way to come out of the lockdown. There are all sorts of opinions and views in science. It's not such a hard and fast thing as people may think. And it doesn't tell us how to live our lives. It doesn't tell us what life's about. It doesn't give us the answer, why we're here, what's the future. I'm not disagreeing with any of epidemiological science. I think it's really powerful. I think it opens up ideas about what the world has been doing that has created the environment in which diseases are transmitted like this, and suggests maybe certain measures could in the future prevent these things happening. But there's something surely more to life, and the Bible is giving us that. It hasn't been discredited. If people look at it carefully and consider it, I think they realize that it just not often people just don't understand what the Bible has actually been saying. If we get back and read it carefully and thoroughly and thoughtfully, I think we'll find this sort of evidence coming through that the Bible knows where we are in the history of the world. It's anticipating the next step, and it's giving us a really solid basis for the development of faith, and that faith can give us hope for the future.
Stephen, I'm going to leave it there. That was such an interesting chat. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks, Peter, for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to talk about these exciting things.
Oh, absolutely. And listen, to all watching online, for both of us, we thank you for joining us. We've been given a lot, haven't we, to think about and reflect on from what Stephen's just talked through with us. But on behalf of the Mumbles Christadelphians, we would say to you at this time, take care, stay safe. But it seems to me, from the reflections we've been given, that it's worth us opening up and reading our Bibles. Thank you for joining us.